that's actually on the good end. If you do the global M2 and weigh it by the supply of every currency and so on, you add the yen in there, the yuan in there, the euro in there, and all these others, ends up being more like 14% on a worldwide basis. For the 7% that the US has, there's somebody out there with like 21%.
Welcome to the Renaissance of Men podcast. My name is Will Spencer. My guest this week is Jimmy Song, and he's the host of the Bitcoin Fixes This podcast and the author of the excellent new book, Fiat Ruins Everything. The title says it all. Fiat currency is the poison that's been leaking into our social systems for the past 50 to 100 years. Since the founding of the Federal Reserve and the abandonment of the gold standard, this has led to different forms of societal decay in many different ways. So when Jimmy says fiat ruins everything, he means it. Here's a short list of the things his book demonstrates fiat is currently ruining: morality, belief, corporations, charity, college, art, knowledge, and much more. How does fiat do this? By corrupting our incentives. Today we hustle rather than delivering value. We court power rather than virtue. We chase fame and status instead of manly skill, all to get next to that source of softening money, which will soon turn to powder in our hands, at the rate of about 7% per year. As I've said many times before, we as men must understand what's happening to the world around us so we can protect our families and our legacy. And while you might not be convinced of Bitcoin yet, I think Jimmy's book is a must-read because it'll convince you of the problem that Bitcoin solves. And when you read it, if you come up with a better solution, I'd love to hear it. In our conversation, Jimmy and I discussed the origins of his book, rent-seeking and the Cantillon effect, stealth taxes and positive rights, credentialism and safety culture, the degradation of art, and finally, the Wizard of Oz conspiracy. If you enjoy the Renaissance of Men podcast, thank you. Please like this video, share it, and subscribe. Plus, hit the bell icon so you get notified when I release new content. A quick note before we begin. The first 18 minutes of this video are audio only, because I forgot to tell Riverside to record video too. Dope. But I caught my mistake and fixed it. So stick around after 18 or so minutes and you'll see video for the rest of the interview. And please welcome this week's guest on the podcast, a Christian husband and father, the host of the Bitcoin Fixes This podcast, and the author of Fiat Ruins Everything, Jimmy Song. Jimmy, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so I just finished up your book, Fiat Ruins Everything, and I really, really enjoyed it. Yes, there we go. We've both got our copies of it. And so I learned a lot from the book. I really appreciated how thoroughly you took apart the pervasive influence of fiat on our culture. But let's take a step back first before we start getting into that. What inspired you to write the book in the first place? Like, why did you say, okay, I need to write, I need to cover this topic in this depth?
Yeah, I don't know if there was like a specific thing that inspired me per se. I mean, I've been doing Bitcoin Fixes This as a podcast for a while, and I knew that this was just you can examine pretty much everything and something comes back to fiat money. Yeah. And what I realized doing that podcast was so much of what Bitcoin fixes isn't that Bitcoin is necessarily injecting holy water into something, right? Like That's not what's happening. What's happening is that you remove the incentives of fiat money and suddenly everything starts working correctly. It's, you could sort of liken it to like your diet or something like that. You're eating something that's really, really bad for you. Say you're gluten intolerant and you're eating gluten all the time. You could add all kinds of good stuff to that gluten. You're still going to be sick because it's just very, very bad for you and you're allergic to it. So, the title Fiat Ruins Everything comes from that. As far as the actual book, I started writing articles for Bitcoin Magazine after taking David Perel's course. He wrote the foreword for my book. He teaches a class online called Rite of Passage. And I've been friends with him for a few years, and I decided finally to go ahead and take his class, last year. And I took it. I felt really empowered to write a lot of stuff. I wrote a lot of stuff and I continued writing more stuff. And eventually it became this book. So it wasn't like a grand plan or anything, or some spark of inspiration, or anything like burning bush level like kind of inspiration or anything like that. It's just something that I wanted to do. I thought it would be interesting, and I thought there'd be an audience for it, and so, I'm happy to find that there is an audience. Yeah.
So when you started sort of taking apart the thesis that the corrupting influence, was there a place, like a first point of entry that you began exploring, or that was most accessible to you?
I think the first place that I naturally went, I think, in this series of articles was about altcoins, and
Yeah.
it's kind of a weird place to think that you're going to get a lot out of it. But the thing about studying altcoins is that you realize very quickly a lot of the people that are in altcoins learn their trade from fiat money. Like they learned how to do a lot of the sort of weird Cantillon games and just like marketing tricks and stuff like that. They got it from fiat money. It's not anything new. So that was sort of like the first series of articles I wrote. It was about altcoins. It was about VCs and stuff like that, and that made it into part 6 of the book. But yeah, I mean, the more I thought about it, the more I wrote, the more I realized, like, okay, it's not just that. There's a lot of other places. Not just financial stuff, but all kinds of stuff that is just completely infected by the presence of a money printer.
Oh, so it was investigating the altcoin phenomenon, seeing how it was tied to fiat. That was the gateway into the corruption of fiat across the culture. Because you went from like science and art and college and knowledge, like you covered a lot of different. I actually felt a little bit. The situation felt a little dire by the end of the book with all the different areas that you touched on. I was like, I need to go stack some more today.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't necessarily like altcoins led to that. It's just I got more curious, and that definitely played a role.
Okay, so it was like an intellectual journey almost, in a way to kind of think through the incentives. So where did you go from there? And I want to get to the Cantillon effect as well, because I think it was the way that you laid out the moral case against the money printer as creating this phenomenon of rent seeking that really shifted the way that I think about the world now, I guess you might say.
Yeah, the entire edifice of rent seeking is something that I've been thinking about for a while now, and I think it was. I didn't really think about what that was. I think I've had a sense most of my life that there's a lot of people that aren't doing that much work, and if you work anywhere, right, like any company, you kind of know who those people are, right? Like you've seen them. They are usually in some sort of gatekeeping function or something like that, where they have to rubber stamp something in order for you to get to do what you think would be actually good for the company that you're working for, or something like that. I didn't really have a word for it until I got to Bitcoin and I started studying some of this stuff, particularly around the mechanics of fiat money and where does all that money go and how is that money distributed and so on. And I realized like that phenomenon that I'd been feeling all my life working at different companies and whatnot, and the inefficiency of the fiat system, they were completely like it sort of like brought the two puzzle pieces together for me. And that's where I started to study how a lot of this works. And once you follow the money even a little bit, you realize, oh, this is where it goes. This is where, things fall apart and things become hyper inefficient and people suspend reality and make money doing nothing. Like that's where this all leads.
So where does the term rent seeking come from? Because I kind of did get a little bit hung up on the etymology of that term at first. Of course, as you explored the thesis throughout the book, I came to have a better, clearer understanding. But I was like, what does it actually literally mean to rent seek?
I think the term comes from sort of like some owner of land that is sort of has sort of a particular position. It's not that their land itself is valuable, but it's like sort of like a connecting piece or something like that. So, say you're you own a part of a road and you like put up a toll there,
Mm-hmm.
that would be kind of rent seeking, where you're not
Oh,
using that to sort of like you're causing a lot of friction in that process, right? So it's a common phenomenon that happens, and it's throughout history. A lot of kings like charge taxes all over the place where they could find sort of these like economic choke points, and governments do the same thing today, right? Like they'll find something that everyone is using and essentially put up a toll there and say, okay, we're collecting here from now on. But that's what that phenomenon is and has been. It's like if you look at economic literature, there's a significant usage of that. I think maybe starting with the oil boom and stuff like that. There's a lot of sort of quote unquote rent seeking. Like Saudi Arabia was a dirt poor country
mm-hmm.
right at the beginning of the 20th century, but as they realized, okay, we're sitting on all of this stuff. They didn't provide any of the technology. They didn't provide any of the market for this oil. But they got they got to collect a lot of money on it because it was so abundant and so available and so on. So in a sense, it's by controlling a particular resource, you have the ability to tax a transaction in some way, shape, or form, and that's essentially what rent seeking is. And because of the way laws work and permission works, and pretty much any society, you can set up for yourself rent-seeking positions. And, like in any efficient economy, those things go away very quickly as soon as you realize like they're not adding value. But in a fiat money system, those things tend to stay and sort of rot the entire system.
Got it. Okay, because that made a lot of sense over time. The nature of the term, especially because I remember when I was in college, the really clear thrust was to get into investment banking, right, or a consulting firm. And I remember being subject to that pressure, like undergraduates, like, oh yeah, no, we're all going to work for Arthur Andersen, and we're going to work 100-hour weeks for a couple of years, and it's like. I felt that there was something lacking from that, or go into investment banking. And when you laid out that these are some, please go ahead. Those are rent-seeking positions by nature.
Yeah. And I had that same pressure, I think, coming out of college too, was, like even like the hardcore engineers, right? The guys that did double E or, mechanical engineering or material sciences engineering or whatever, they were all like going and interviewing with these like consulting firms. And like try to get into that management consulting stuff. And honestly, like what management consulting is largely trying to find out where the rent seekers are and trying to eliminate their jobs. That's what it ends up being.
Yes.
And it's kind of funny because you talk to any management consultant, and I have a lot of friends that went into that area. And they'll tell you like, oh yeah, I consulted for this company with 20,000 employees or whatever. Yeah, you could cut half of them. Yeah, like no problem. You could just cut half of them. Nothing would happen to the company. And we kind of saw that play out in real time at like Twitter with Elon Musk. He literally just eliminated 90%. What were they doing? Right? Like what did they do anything of value? Because the site runs very similarly. I mean, politically, maybe it's changed, but that's not like because of the 90% of the people that left. So there was that like the far more ambitious people ended up going to investment banking, of course, and that is serious rent seeking. You can get like 100x leverage on some of these trades. And that's what they did to make a lot of money. And anytime you hear the word leverage, you should think loan. Like somebody is borrowing a lot of money, and where does that loan come from in a fiat economy? It's just printed into existence. So investment banks have a sick amount of leverage available to them, and it's why they're so rich. And yeah, sadly, that's where the most talented people go, and not to say nuclear engineering, figuring out how to get like a nuclear jet engine that could, probably fly around the world multiple times without refueling, right? Like that would be something crazy, but it's possible because that's how energy dense nuclear power is. But we haven't progressed at all on that since maybe the 60s. And that's kind of the state of the things how things are right now.
Yeah, you get into that as well with science and technology and how rent seeking feeds in. Okay, so let's go back to the Cantillon effect then, because I have a lot of people who listen to my podcast who are into Bitcoin. I would like more of you to be into Bitcoin, but what I thought was the dynamics that you laid out that was very helpful was understanding the Cantillon effect and how things spread outwards from there to create this basically world of rent seekers. So let's start with the Fed and the Cantillon effect to sort of set the stage for how how rent seeking shows up in our world today.
Yeah, so the Cantillon effect is named after Richard Cantillon, and he was an Irish-French economist from about early 18th century. So the Bank of England was created in 1697, I think. So he was in that first generation of people that witnessed what a central bank does, right, and how it affects the economy and so on. So he wrote a bunch of stuff about his observations on what happened with the Bank of England, and one of the things that he pointed out was, okay, the people that get to spend the money first get a lot of the benefits, right? The people that spend it last don't get any of the benefits, and he wrote a bunch of papers related to that. Among other things, he noted that manufacturing, because of the Cantillon effect of the British pound and it being the sort of the world reserve currency at that point, meant that all of the manufacturing jobs left England because labor was always cheaper somewhere else. And that's where all of these middle class manufacturing jobs ended up going to. And that's obviously something that we see in the U.S. today, especially since 1971. Pretty much every manufacturing job has left. I mean, there's maybe like United Auto Workers with automobiles and so on, but they had to fight tooth and nail to get that. And there are multiple government subsidies that make that possible, especially in the South and so on, where these manufacturing jobs are essentially saved through government intervention. But that's the essence of the Cantillon effect, is that the people that get to spend it first get a lot of the benefits because they get to spend it before the inflation is known to everybody else. If you print a couple $1 trillion, the first spenders of that money get the benefits. The very last spenders, it's the same as any other money that they already have. So they're the ones that get screwed over, whereas the first people, particularly government and pretty much anyone that has access to a lot of loans, they're the ones that benefit.
Yeah. So if a dollar comes out of the money printer, the person standing right there gets a dollar, and by the time it works its way through the economy, comparatively, it's 99 cents or 97 cents or 90 cents. And so the dollar that gets printed is worth less and less the further it gets from the printer itself.
Yeah, that's correct. And you kind of saw this dynamic during the pandemic because we had a lot of money that was injected almost directly into the economy in the form of PPP loans and stimmy checks. So people in the U.S., like I know people that were working at like really high-end car dealerships and stuff, and they'd see someone come in with like $180,000. Hey, give me a car, right? Like I just want it. That was the Cantillon effect in action. They were trying to spend it into the economy before everything inflated, and in a sense they did, because the inflation came like a year and a half later when all of the prices of everything actually rose up to meet that. But before that happened, you had this sort of window where if you had access to this money, then you could go spend it at par before the pre-inflation. Now, afterwards, after the inflation happened, then, like it's sort of par for everybody. It's the same for everybody. But the people that got to spend it first, they got a lot of the benefit. And if you go to a lot of other countries, you notice that the Cantillon effect was still sort of like evening, like still in process, right? Like you had other countries that were experiencing inflation, and in a sense, like as you get disruption in the dollar, you get disruptions in every other currency because they use it as their reserve currency, and that inflation hadn't necessarily occurred yet. So for a lot of U.S. travelers, it's pretty cheap to go abroad and spend things, and and in a sense, if you're a U.S. citizen or someone that gets paid in the dollar, you're able to benefit from the Cantillon effect. Whereas, somebody that doesn't get paid in the dollar or transacts in it at the very end of the chain, and the example I give in the book is of somebody in North Korea. Where their black markets are, run on foreign currency. They don't use local currency. And of the foreign currencies that are used, the US dollar is the most desirable. And for them, prices have gone up significantly. And they're getting sort of screwed out on the Cantillon effect as a result of all the money printing that happened starting in 2020.
So I think a lot of people would be pretty surprised to hear about the way that the Cantillon effect, the way that the money printer affects the world globally. By the way, as you're giving these answers, I'm thinking of all these different chapters that you have in the book. It makes me just want to dive into the content, particularly around the dollar hegemony. Like, it's such a complicated web of topics that you tackled in a systemic way. But I think people would be really surprised to hear that the way that this actually does benefit Americans, when Americans are always the ones. Now we're thinking about inflation. It's like, well, no, we're getting the better end of the deal comparatively.
Yeah, it is. And, I point out in the book that, with the dollar, Americans do suffer from inflation. That much is fact. If you look at the M2 money supply from 1959 to 2023, it's gone from 289 billion to 21 trillion and change, something like that. And that's about a 70x increase in the M2 money supply. And if you annualize that, that ends up being about 7% a year. So your money is getting debased at 7% a year. But that's actually on the good end. If you do the global M2 and weigh it by the supply of every currency and so on, you add the yen in there, the yuan in there, and the rem, and the euro in there, and all these others, and you do the global M2, ends up being more like 14% on a worldwide basis. And that's something that you can go learn from Safeteen's new book, Principles of Economics. So for the 7% that the U.S. has, there's somebody out there with like 21%. That's that's like the real debasement. So in a sense, the U.S. citizens, they have it bad. I think 7% a year is still pretty terrible. But the people in the developing world, it's way, way worse. And it's on a continuous basis. And it does fits and starts, and you get hyperinflation like you have in Lebanon right now or in Argentina. But that's your wealth is being taken away from you on an almost constant basis. But yeah, U.S. not nearly as bad, and you can clearly see it when you go travel. I mean, I spent the last year traveling with my family, and I can tell you that the U.S. was the most expensive out of all the places we visited.
Mm-hmm.
That's not something that a lot of people realize yet, because they don't know the prices of things in Singapore or Tokyo or whatever. But the U.S. is actually the most expensive at the moment, and this is a sign of the Cantillon effect at play.
Yes, I traveled quite a bit between 2016 and 2020, like even before they really ramped up the money printer to the level it's at right now. And that was always the thing. People always talked about wanting to travel to the US. I mean, in addition to the fact the United States is huge, you can't really see the whole country like you can a Singapore or a Japan. But that aside, even visiting the US, it was cost prohibitive for most people to even think about visiting, versus in other countries, my American dollars would go quite far, depending on where, like less far in Japan and less far in Australia, but go to a place like China, or India, all day.
Well, I mean, nowadays, like even Japan and Australia and New Zealand, like those are actually very affordable places because the dollar is doing so well. I think I saw earlier today, it was like 150 yen to a dollar or something like that.
Oh, wow.
Which is, I mean, for a long time there was about 100. And even more recently, it was like 120, 130 or something like that. So it's like the effect is there, and it's, if not for the Bank of Japan sort of defending their currency, I'm sure it would be even higher than 150. But these are the games at play, and these are how the world runs. It's all based on central banks and money printing and the various financial games they all play to pull the wool over our eyes about what's actually going on.
I want to take just a brief detour into the notion of the woke and the social justice warriors in America who are so committed to justice and equality, quote unquote. It's like, if you were really as committed to that, maybe you take a look at the central banks and see what's really going on there.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's sad because for them, monetary justice is not even on their radar at all, right? Like, and how it works. For many of them, it's sort of like this positive right mindset, which I didn't write about in the book, but I can explain here. The idea of positive rights is that you force other people to do something for you. So the right to healthcare is a positive right, because without doctors or nurses performing that service, it's not something that can be provided for you, right? Whereas like the right to free speech, there's no service that you're demanding from somebody else. Those are what you would call negative rights. As soon as you have positive rights, you require some sort of money printer or some authoritarianism in order to make happen. So a lot of the things that the left woke people want are positive rights, and they almost always end up with some sort of enslavement of a subset of people or some rampant money printing to make it work. And unfortunately, because of that dynamic where a lot of the positive rights that they want, right to housing or right to healthcare or whatever, come from that Cantillon effect, the fiat money that's printed on their behalf, that mechanism, they've almost purposefully neglected the actual mechanics or the moral culpability that they share in pushing those policies.
This is great. This allows me to kind of transition in some of the content of the book itself around how government has been using the money printer to fund the growth of entitlement programs, because that is very up for a lot of people right now. So let's start there with the first pervasive effect of the money printer, of enabling this kind of giant government situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, the thing about being able to print money is that it's a stealth tax. Inflation is a tax without any transparency, any legislation, or any sort of responsibility taken by anybody. Right? It's something that, as you get inflation, every government bureaucrat starts blaming anything but the actual thing that caused it, which is the actual money printing. So. You've seen, I think Safety had like a whole bunch of tweets on like the crazy things that people are blaming inflation for. It's like Beyonce caused inflation by, like having too many shows, or like just absolutely ridiculous stuff. In Canada, Trudeau is blaming grocery stores for being greedy. It's like, no, that's just the economics, right? Like you're forced to raise the prices when the cost of the components goes up and so on. But this is the game that every politician can play, is blame inflation on something else. So it becomes this very convenient tax that you can always sort of like dip your hand into whenever you need money. And using that money, you can promise lots of free stuff. And as you stated before, the thing that a lot of people like is like free money, right? Like, and this is essentially what entitlements are. And these are the epitome of positive rights. It's a right to healthcare past a certain age, or a right to have, universal basic income after a certain age, or something like that. You might call it some sort of insurance or something, but really it's money being printed out thin air for your benefit. And you might have other taxpayers and whatever, and there's certainly like lots of liability on behalf of the government to provide a lot of this stuff, but it's all just money printed out of thin air to for politicians to win votes of one type or another. And that's what they've done, is they've bribed the populace into voting for them by promising them free things. And that's the dynamic that happens as you as you have this stealth taxation. Now, if you didn't have this option of stealth taxation like we did in the gold standard, government tends to be much more limited because you have to create an explicit tax every time you want to fund the program. So if you wanted to give universal basic income like Andrew Yang wants to do or whatever, then you would actually have to go and tax somebody else to fund that. And as soon as you start taxing people, they get up in a revolt, right? And this is the cause of a lot of revolutions, is explicit taxation, and this is why politicians have sort of shied away from it. But because of the presence of this stealth taxation through central bank monetary policy, this is the direction that most of them have gone in, and you get a lot of these entitlements that come into play, a lot of sort of vote buying and things like that, and then it creates bureaucratic apparatuses all over the place, and it favors certain constituents and so on, and you kind of get the mess that we have now. We could get into a lot of the other things that this affects, but on a first order basis, it's let's give free stuff to people that are going to vote for me. That's the dynamic at play here.
Yes. So let's unpack the term stealth tax. Like why is, I know the answer to the question, but why is money printing a stealth tax for people that are new to this topic set?
Yeah, so it's a stealth tax because there's no, IRS coming to collect your money for inflation, right? The collection doesn't happen on the front end. It's actually more on the back end as you pay for goods and services. So as you go and shop for steak, for example, how much is it right now versus 3 years ago? I know, like at the beginning of the pandemic, I was able to get like a prime ribeye at like $10 a pound. Now it's more like 18 or 19 a pound, right? Like it's that's clearly inflation right there. It's a taxation through diluting the dollar. So if you think about explicit taxation, you can think of that as sort of taking away from the numerator. You have some numerator, right? Like this is the amount of money you have, and the denominator is all the amount of money that exists. So you have some fraction of all money that exists. Explicit taxation is taking money from the numerator. Implicit taxation is adding money to the denominator. So either way, the worth that you've accumulated is going away. But the implicit taxation is much more subtle because you don't see your number go down, right? Like there's no government saying, all right, I'm going to take half of your money right away from your bank account. We're just going to double, like increase the amount of M2 money available by 30% or something like that. And next thing you know, everything just costs more. And the government has some plausible deniability around that. So it's stealth in that way, but it's taxation because what you have is being taken away from you sort of without your consent.
Yeah, that picture, once that came into focus, the way that inflation really robs us of the value of our money in a way that explicit tax actually just takes your money from you, and implicit tax takes away the value of your money, and it's the same effect through a couple different doors.
Yeah, and it's just complicated enough and not taught in school enough that most people have like very little idea of what's actually going on.
Yeah, they feel the impact, and they watch on the news as inflation is discussed, not to the degree that it's 7% per year, but that's what you end up feeling, and yet they can obscure the source of it because no one is ever allowed to really look at. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain is the rule with the Fed.
Yeah, that whole you just referenced the Wizard of Oz. There's a whole interesting thing about how that's actually the story of the end of the gold standard, and the Emerald City is the greenback, and the yellow brick road is the gold standard. The cowardly lion are politicians, and the scarecrow are farmers, and the Tin Man are industrialists. It's like a whole allegory about that era and bringing in the Federal Reserve and so on. So that's a whole rabbit hole that you can go down, and but the Wizard of Oz is actually a commentary on the monetary system that we have.
Okay, let's explore that for a minute if we can. So I had heard something like that. I don't know that I'd ever been all the way down the rabbit hole, but just kind of unpack that, because I think you'll have everyone's attention.
So the idea is that you have this Wizard of Oz, right? That's great and powerful, and turns out to be this guy behind the curtain that's like pulling a couple of levers. That's the Federal Reserve. It's literally somebody like pulling a couple of levers and just hoping something happens. And it's the Emerald City because it's the greenback, the dollar. The green is that color, and the yellow brick road is the gold standard, and sort of like the end of the gold standard, ending at the Emerald City. And Dorothy is like going with these political constituents that ultimately all gave in to the Federal Reserve. These are like the farmers. At the time, there was before that, it was the gold bugs and silver bugs. They tried to introduce bimetallism, and that was a big monetary sort of conflict that a lot of farmers were engaged in. And in a sense, they didn't have a brain, right? Like that was the thing. Then you had the industrialists who were the Rockefellers and the robber barons, right? The U.S. Steel, the J.P. Morgans, and all of those people. If you read Creature from Jekyll Island, you find out like they're the ones that were actually responsible for the establishment of the Federal Reserve, and they're the ones without a heart, right? Like they just have no compassion for anybody else. Just they're very, very selfish in that way. And then the Cowardly Lion, these were the politicians, and of course they had no courage, so they just like let everything through because, in a sense, they felt threatened by all of these other constituents, and that led to the establishment of the Federal Reserve. And yeah, I mean that's the interpretation that I've heard, and I think it's fairly accurate. Like if you think about that era and the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913 and all the constituencies that came together to essentially create that. But yeah, it does end up with a man behind the curtain that does sort of like magic behind the scenes, and nobody sort of like sees it for what it is unless like you peek. Yeah. So that's what that's about.
I will definitely have to find some links. I had heard that a while ago, but I had forgotten what the allegory was. That sounds right to me. I'm curious, like what it would all have symbolism, like what's the Wicked Witch of the West and the East and the ruby slippers. It almost means something, right?
Yeah. And I think in the book it was like white slippers or something like that.
Oh, okay.
And I think for because of Technicolor and the contrast that the filmmakers wanted, they made it into ruby or something like that. But yeah, there's a whole lot of symbolism. There's like a whole 50-page paper going into the details about what happened and so on. Which I think I read at one point, and that's where I've gotten most of it. So yeah.
So okay, so we've got the Cantillon effect, we've got stealth taxes, and let's plug rent seeking into this, because I think those are the three big pieces. You have let's put the rent seeking framework into that.
Mm-hmm. So when you have the Cantillon effect, and you have this ability to money print, you have politicians that are essentially handing out free stuff to people. You inevitably get a lot of that money that's supposed to go to the people needing some sort of like bureaucratic state to distribute it or whatever benefit it might be. Now it could be like during the New Deal, for example, there are all sorts of like work programs and things like that. There were different dams being built, capital projects, whatever. And that's money being printed. That's money coming into existence to fund all of that stuff. And that requires some sort of bureaucratic state, right? Like you got to distribute it somehow. Somebody has to be in the middle somewhere. And right there is when rent seeking starts, is you have somebody sitting in the middle, some sort of bureaucrat that's in charge of distributing the money or spending the money in a particular way to achieve some end. And and if you think about the position of the bureaucrat, they're spending somebody else's money for somebody else's benefit. Now, if you're spending your own money for your own benefit, you're going to be very careful about the value that you're getting and the money that you're spending. If you're spending somebody else's money for your benefit, you're going to get the best thing that you can possibly get because it's not your money. And if you're spending your own money for somebody else's benefit and you're a cheapskate, you're probably going to like just get the cheapest thing out there, right? Because it's your money. But if you're spending somebody else's money for somebody else's benefit, you have no motive to care about anything. And government jobs being how they are, especially nowadays, you basically have no motivation to do any of that. So what ends up happening is that they do figure out ways to get benefit themselves. So this is where cronyism, bribery, sort of corruption come in, is that if you are a bureaucrat that's spending somebody else's money for somebody else's benefit, you often try to find ways to get kickbacks or something like that. And that could be explicitly corrupt, but more likely it's going to be just based on your ideology. All right, I'm going to push my ideology on this particular thing. And so I'm going to make sure that that even if I'm not benefiting, maybe my friends and family are benefiting, or my group, or the people that I represent, or people that are in my in-group, that they get a benefit. So becomes this sort of like bureaucracy, and they're going to get kind of paid regardless. They're not judged by the market. It's judged by whoever is in charge of that program. If they continue to give out those benefits, then they're going to have a job. So their motive becomes very different than in a free market. In a free market, you have to satisfy your customers. In a bureaucracy, you just satisfy your boss. And ultimately, that's just whoever is printing the money. So you get a lot of that sort of starting to grow as you have money printing available, as you have loans available, as you have central banks sort of churning out money for whatever reason. And all of the free stuff that gets sort of given out needs some management and so on. So that's kind of where rent seeking starts, but it definitely doesn't end there, because oftentimes what happens is the large companies that are in an economy like that recognize the power of bureaucracy and regulation. So what they'll attempt to do, because politics is so easily malleable through lobbying and so on, they'll spend resources lobbying Congress for one reason or another. Now, a popular one is to protect their turf. So that a common one would be adding regulation to their industry. So to get into cars right now is extremely difficult, right? Like there are so many regulations around how an automobile has to function, and fuel economy standards and safety standards, and like what kind of steel you can use and all this other stuff. That most automobiles these days look pretty much the same, right? I saw a picture of like the 50 different cars all in white. They look almost all exactly the same from 12 different car manufacturers and so on. It's because there's a lot of regulation around it. And if you try to introduce something too new, then it's probably not going to meet that regulation. Now, the purpose of that is to keep newcomers out. It's the newcomers have a difficult time coming in and having the capital to spend to meet all of those regulations. And if you look at other countries which don't have these regulations, you find that they've come up with all kinds of creative ways to like transport. If you've been to India, I'm sure you know about tuk-tuks, right? Like they could carry 4 people. They're not like the most luxurious ride in the world, but they're still motorized, right? And you can carry a lot of stuff. They're maybe a couple $1,000s at the most, right? Probably significantly less than that. And you could have something like that. And in a market like the United States, I believe there would be a lot of people that would be willing to buy something like that. But that's not allowed through regulation. It's a way to keep out the newcomers and not allow sort of like new stuff to come in so that the current auto manufacturers can stay in their position in the economy. And it's not just auto manufacturers; it's pretty much everything. How hard is it to open a bank in the United States right now?
Mm-hmm.
How difficult is that? Some sort of agricultural company or food processing company or anything like that. Almost all of if you look at almost every industry, you end up finding that there are like 4 or 5 giant companies that control everything. 5 big ag companies, 5 meat processing plants, and even like the food that you find at the grocery store, like it's made by like maybe 10 companies total, like all the stuff in the middle. 4 big accounting firms and 6 different banks, and it's just these giant companies that have control over a whole bunch of stuff. And this myth that the U.S. is constantly innovating, it's simply not true. Like there are a lot of entrepreneurs and they're trying, but it is just so difficult to break into the ranks of the powerful enough where you can actually produce things at scale and profitably. It's the result of regulatory capture by these large companies and the rent seeking bureaucrats that want to continue supporting a lot of these places. Because in a sense, like you might not get bribed while you're a rent seeker, right? Like at like one of the 3-letter agencies or something, the FDA or something like that. But after a career of 10 years there, guess what? You get hired by a drug company. And now, I mean, like in any other, if it was done in the other order, it would be just called bribery straight up. But that's what it ends up being. It's because of the presence of rent seekers. But a lot of these large companies, in order to meet a lot of these regulations that they fight for as a way to keep out a lot of new players, they end up being rent seekers themselves within these companies. And this is where you get sort of very cringy, weird, positions in a lot of HR departments, right? Like where you have, diversity coordinators and I don't know, like compliance personnel that comply to particular things, and you have to go take weird HR sexual harassment policy videos for like 2 days before you can start working or something like that. This is all the cost of rent seeking of getting some bureaucrats' permission.
You make me think about safety culture, because what's the number one thing that all these regulators say? Oh, we have to keep people safe, right? And why do we have to keep people safe? We have to keep people safe because they'll sue. And when people will sue because there's all this money to pay for torts and the money printer funds all of it, and you have this slow degradation of culture that's designed to keep us all safe, when in fact it's just kind of neutering us in some pretty powerful ways.
Yeah, and safety is nice, and it makes people think that it's going to be better because you're safe. But I would argue that that's exactly how you start crumbling and start degrading as a civilization. There's an interesting experiment from I think it was like late 60s or something. This was Mouse Universe or something like that. Basically, this researcher created an environment for mice to thrive. So he gave them all the food that they wanted, and he created this very large room that mice could thrive in. There's a lot of different places that you can go live and thrive. So he gave them everything that they needed, right? It was no predators. It was basically Mouse Utopia, and he observed what happened. So they thrive for a while. They multiply for a while. At a certain point, it became before it reached capacity. He started noticing that the mice weren't behaving normally, right? So a lot of females got hyper aggressive. A lot of males just sort of checked out. And soon, like, the population started declining, right? The population started declining. And then eventually the entire colony just died out, which is crazy because they had everything that they needed, no predators, nothing, but it still died out. And one of the lessons that I think we can learn from that experiment is that you need some struggle. You can't have safety in everything. And in fact, like mice kind of need that like environmental pressure to thrive. And if you have nothing to push against, then you kind of get weird behavior. And like they don't act the way that normal mice should. And like there's a lot of analogies to current day. We see a lot of men checking out. There's like a whole MGTOW movement, and a lot of men just refusing to have children or get married and stuff. And you have hyper aggressive women too, right? Like we're seeing a lot of that. But that's kind of what happens when you have too much safety. Is that you don't have any frontiers anymore. You don't have anywhere to push. You don't have anything to strive for. And in a sense, like the mice lost purpose. I think as a society, we kind of lost purpose too, where it's just, the thing that everyone's afraid of now is just death, and that's it. And if you look historically, that's like not something most people were afraid of. In fact, it was like considered glorious to die in battle in a lot of these cultures and stuff. Instead, we're like COVID just sort of exposed the fact that so many people were so afraid of their mortality that they wouldn't go outside at all. Like they were living for nothing other than their own lives. And those were the people that were most depressed, most sort of like cut off from everything. And this is kind of what you get when you're prioritizing safety. But you're right. Like what fiat money does is it says, all right, you have anxiety about this. I am going to relieve that anxiety through money. And you do that enough, and you get kind of a society that's not building anymore. That's just concerned with living a little longer and not at all about the next generation or the generation after, and so on.
It sort of makes me think of the meme, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, right? All that, that whole thing. And that's a little bit where we're at, but I don't know that I might have to make the meme myself. I don't know that anyone's plugged the money printer into that. Like, hard men gonna make good times create money printer. Money printer creates, right?
I did see a meme like that, I think, a few days ago, but I don't know. It's like, money printer creates weak times creates sound money creates good times, and good times create money printer or something like that. But it's this cycle of good times and bad versus sort of acting out of courage and fear. And unfortunately that we're at the part of the cycle where we're acting out of fear and we're really headed towards bad times.
Well, and those rent-seeking positions are mostly staffed by the weak men and the hyper-aggressive women, right? Like,
I would say that a lot of rent-seeking positions actually have a prestige in the economy, right? Like if you're working for a think tank in DC, right? Like that's considered very prestigious. Really, you're not doing anything. You're producing fancy-sounding reports for somebody, and they might or might not
reports.
use it. Yeah, something like that. But it's considered prestigious because you're doing relatively little amount of work for a relatively lot of money, right? Like that ratio is what people are looking at, is how much work do I have to do to get a lot of money? And rent-seeking positions are fairly high in that regard. You get tremendous, you get compensated very well for the very little amount of work that you do. So when you have rent-seeking jobs available, everybody wants them. Not a surprise, right? Everybody wants them because they can make a lot of money for doing very little work. Who doesn't want a job like that? But this is the problem. Is first of all, there's not enough of those, so you get sort of selection based on cronyism and so on. And worse, you get the best people in an economy going to those jobs. So investment banking is probably one of the worst in terms of rent seeking. You still have to work hard, but the rewards are enormous, right? You're making $100 million for, doing a few trades or something like that, or writing some Excel spreadsheets on like how to on the projections on what would happen if you followed a particular strategy. I don't know, whatever it is. But that ends up being very prestigious, very desirable, and that's where people go. And unfortunately, that means that all of the other stuff don't get the people that would be talented at these other things. I point out in the book that travel times from New York to London have gotten worse since the 1960s, right? And this is partly due to regulation, partly due to just sort of like the staticness of aircraft design, and part of that is because there's really only two commercial airline manufacturers in the world right now. It's just Boeing and Airbus, and there are enough regulations in all of these countries that it's very unlikely that a newcomer will now be coming out and saying, "Oh, we're going to make planes too now." Like that's just not going to happen because it's too hard to break into that. But it used the first Boeing 747 from conception to rolling one off the assembly line and having it ready to fly was something like 20 months. The most recent one was 747 Max took something like 10 years. That should tell you, okay, either we've like gotten so crazy with regulation that it takes that long, or we've lost a lot of talent in the aerospace engineering field. And it's a little bit of both, but I suspect it's way more the second than the first. We used to have a lot of talent going into aerospace manufacturing, right? Like the engineering and so on. We don't anymore because they've gotten into, investment banking or, Web3 startup or, Silicon Valley thing or whatever. That's where the talented people are going. So rent seeking has like a significant cost in so many ways, not just in sort of the value taken out of everybody else through the actual taxation of a lot of the transactions that we would normally engage in, but also the opportunity costs because these people in a sound money economy would probably be like nuclear engineers or aerospace engineers or people creating better stuff that all of us could use and benefit from. Instead, they're sitting at a terminal executing an FX trade for the benefit of their LPs, right? Like this is what rent seeking does. It degrades at multiple layers and multiple levels.
A second ago, I made a joke about TPS reports from the movie Office Space, but it's an interesting phenomenon. I think that movie came out in like '99, something like that, and that movie, The Matrix, and Fight Club all came out the same year. And now that I listen to you talk about this, there's a way in which, and all three of those movies feature guys in soulless corporate jobs, essentially rent seeking, longing for a life of a more direct experience of reality. Like you have the Office Space guy. What does he end up doing? He ends up working in construction, right? Like digging a ditch, but providing value. Neo ends up, being the savior of humanity or whatever in some technological sense. But then you have Fight Club. He ends up being like some sort of revolutionary, but he still wants a more immediate sense. And I remember reading the book. That was the sense that I got, that I had been cultivated my whole life to have a rent seeking kind of job. And that was, I think, what the boomers kind of expected their kids to do, because they saw the money. They didn't know that it was the money printer, but they saw the thing switch on with all its profitability and prosperity. 80s, like get close to where the money is, as opposed to engage with reality and create value.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point about like sort of the soullessness of rent seeking, and if you know anybody in investment banking, ask them what they do on Friday. Ask them what they do on Friday and Saturday night. Like this is an industry that probably has the most alcohol abuse, and the most drug abuse
Yeah.
anywhere, right? Like they now, why is that? It's I think deep down, all of these people know that they're not really providing value, right? They know that really they're stealing from other people, and that they have to drown out their conscience through drugs and other means to live with themselves. And it's unfortunate, but that's the case in a lot of industries now, right? You mentioned office space. A lot of office workers are like, am I making anything of a difference? Am I doing anything? And especially if your company is not profitable at all, there's like prima facie evidence that you aren't providing any value because you're losing money, right? Like you're consuming resources. Um, that's so common today that I think there's a lot of other things that are there to just sort of numb us out to that. I think a lot of entertainment is like that. A lot of video games, a lot of yeah, I mean, even down to CrossFit or whatever. People use those things as a way to distract themselves from sort of the utter lack of meaning that their jobs actually have. Oh, I'm a divorce lawyer. I do
Mm.
this. Are you really making the world better in any way, or are you just a giant rent seeker that benefits from the disunion of marriages, right? Like a
Yeah.
lot of people, I think, are very depressed as a result of that. And we tend to think that, like, or we've been told this lie that depression is a result of like some chemical imbalance or whatever. And if you study any of that, they're realizing that's probably not it, even though they've made all this medication based on that or whatever. I think it's really that, okay, you're not providing value. How should you feel about it? Like, ultimately, if you're not providing value, well, like, you should kind of be depressed. Yeah, you're detracting from humanity. You're there should be a part of your conscience that's speaking up and saying, like, this is not right. Um, and unfortunately, a lot of people medicate that instead of trying to listen to it. And like, part of what's great about all three movies is that they're all kind of fantasies, right? It's a way to break out of these rent seeking things because it is so unsatisfactory. Uh, but if you are providing value, I think it's not like that at all. You recognize that you are providing value, and you have motivation to go and do a lot of that stuff. It's sort of all connected together, all of the ills of society that you're seeing, and it comes down to ultimately the fact that you're not providing value, and that's motivated by the incentives of fiat money.
Let's unpack the term providing value for men, just to make it very, very basic. Because I think it's important. I think a lot of men have this sense that they're not doing this thing described as providing value, but what does that mean in actuality?
Yeah. So in any economy, you have lots of trades, right? I give you some money and you give me something. Now, when those trades take place, both people are benefiting. I find the thing that you're providing, whether it's a good or service, more valuable than the money I am parting with. And it could be the opposite. I'm the one providing a good or service, and you're paying me money. But that's the essence of a trade. And the nice thing about a trade is that both parties, at least subjectively, are feeling good about that trade. This is where you're getting value. So if I'm a cobbler and I have a lot of shoes, I mean, I'm not going to use more than like 3 pairs of shoes, right? Like, but I'm a cobbler, so I make like 100. The 100th pair of shoes, like, are more or less not worth anything to me because I have plenty of shoes. But for you, if it's your first, second, third, fourth pair of shoes, you're very willing to go pay me some money for that. So we both benefit in that trade. You're adding value to me because I'm getting rid of something that I don't want for something that I do want. And you're benefiting from the trade because you're getting something that you want for something that you don't want, right? Like, you have sort of like, you're getting more value relatively from that. So that's ultimately what providing value is. It's just participating in voluntary trades with other people. Now, to get people to trade with you, you have to give them something that they want. And that's not to say that every desire people have is something that should be met with, I mean, like, I'm sure there's a market for child porn or whatever, but that's not a good thing to engage in, right? Like, that's not something, among other things, it's illegal, but that's not something that you should necessarily be providing. The the thing that you want to provide that adds value is actually like makes their life better in some way, and I think a large portion of things do that. Unfortunately, we also have that other side of stuff, which is basically numbing out the the conscience or something like that. I don't think that's necessarily value additive, but that gets a little more subjective. But from a more classical way of thinking about value in terms of economics is, we do a trade, and you do lots of trades. That's how you add value. Unfortunately, you have like salary positions and stuff like that where it's not at all clear what you're trading and what you're getting, and whether both parties are really like making that decision like logically. Because if a company hires you, right, like, and it's based on a salary over a year, they're sort of guessing that maybe you can provide at least that much value, but they have no idea. And there are so many companies that would love to fire like half their people, like, I mentioned before with the management consultants, but they can't because there's like all sorts of legal liabilities and things like that, and they can't. So you have weird incentives there, and I think once fiat money enters the equation, a lot of these trades don't add value. But that's how I would define it. Like, in a free market, if you're trading a good or service for money and back and forth, you're providing value in some way.
So men are trapped in this kind of, well, many of us are trapped in this kind of fiat universe, this fiat world full of zombie, hyper-regulated companies, engaging in economic transactions for a time where we're not adding any value, and that makes us depressed and alcoholic and numbing out with entertainment. And it's all because of the money printer.
Yeah, I would say so. And like, you're not really making anything better for anybody. And I think ultimately what men want is to be useful, right? Like to people. And unfortunately, like a lot of these giant corporations, it is not at all clear if you're adding value or subtracting value, whether you're a rent seeker or somebody that's actually like part of a team that's doing something good. Vast majority of them, I think, are subtracting value. Like, you have so many rent seekers in a lot of these bureaucratic positions, and a lot of these large companies see the employees more as an asset because they have political power as a result of that. So I don't know if you remember in 2008 when GM went bankrupt, part of the reason why they got bailed out was because of the United Auto Workers. There were so many employees that, like, it was politically expedient for the government to bail them out, and so they did. So, that's part of the calculus for a lot of these companies. They don't really want you for you; they want you for sort of your political power and things like that. And I like it. That's not what you are, right? Like, you want to be useful for the skills that you bring to the table, for the goods or services that you provide to others. And I think for like a lot of small business owners, that's actually one of the things that's very nice is you are providing a good or service directly to customers, and they're getting something, they're paying you, right? Like, that's a wonderful thing, and it's very satisfactory. Unfortunately, we've gotten away from that, where we don't know our customer, right? It's some faceless corporate entity or faceless bureaucracy or something like that employs us instead of like actual customers. We're so many people have one customer and they don't even know who the customer is. It's like a fictional corporate entity or government bureaucracy or something like that. It's not really a person. It's just, I mean, there are people involved, but it's at least technically speaking, it's not really a person. So yeah, it's no wonder a lot of people are just doubtful of their contribution and kind of get stuck in rent seeking and so on.
It would be kind of shocking for people to hear that their giant corporation only employs them because having a high head count makes them a political force that then the CEO or what or their industry can leverage to get more money from the money printer. Like that's what you're doing there essentially.
Yeah, that and the fact that it's very difficult to fire you. Like a lot of large companies, they're deathly afraid of getting a lawsuit, and it's actually cheaper for them to keep you on the payroll unless they have like layoffs or something where it's they could kind of do that with impunity. Like specifically firing a particular person is extremely difficult in government or in a large company. So you get some weird dynamics there where people are kind of incentivized to do the bare minimum if they're not getting promoted, and a lot of people do that. But yeah, there's a lot of factors that go in. It's not just that you're politically useful or something. There are other factors. Surely part of it is like how you contribute as an actual employee, right? If you're doing accounts receivable for an accounting department, you're probably doing something, right? That's valuable to the company. But like maybe you're part of the DEI statistic where that makes it look good for BlackRock, so that they'll invest more money into your corporation or something. And those are things that you're maybe not ever going to know. Maybe like no one's ever going to admit it and say, you were 20% higher because you're black, and 10% higher because of this, and 30% higher because of this. But I suspect that a significant percentage of why we're hired in a lot of these places is for the purposes of satisfying some bureaucratic checkbox.
So as you were looking at the other areas that you saw at Fiat Ruins, what were some of your favorites to research and write about? Because I could start, I mean, you have about 30 or 40 chapters of it. So, I mean, I really genuinely would like to go into each one, but like, let's pick out some of your favorites that you found, we'll say enjoyable in the broadest sense.
I think I triggered a lot of people with the art chapter, so that was a pretty fun one.
Let's go with that one. I wanted to ask you about that one. I enjoyed that chapter, frankly.
Yeah. And I had another podcast where I talked about this in depth, but like it was a little bit surprising to me that was the most controversial chapter, because like pretty much like everything else, it was like, oh yeah, that's true. Art? What? No.
What? Really?
Yeah. Like in a way, it's the most sort of like soft authoritative thing that we're under is the art thing. Yeah, like you complain about education or science, people kind of know. Yeah, it's screwed up.
Yeah.
Like it's objectively obvious that those are screwed up. But you start talking about art, and they're like, oh, it's completely subjective. You don't know what you're talking about, blah blah blah.
No,
like,
really?
It's really subjective. Then why are you telling me that I shouldn't have this opinion, right? Like. But I think part of it is that art has been sort of like we've been gaslit into thinking that bad art is good art, right? Like this is something that's kind of taught all day long in K through 12, and every museum, modern art museum at least, like celebrates these like very obscure, weird pieces of abstractness. And a lot of artists, especially like they're sort of like the cultural experts, I guess. They are very afraid to criticize any other art, and that ends up making it so that like when we have other opinions, they make us sound like country bumpkins or something that don't know anything. And I think honestly, a lot of artists are very sensitive to criticism as well. And if you criticize any art, they feel like you're criticizing them. It's a weird dynamic. But I've seen this with a lot of artists where they take offense on part of, you know, like not even necessarily something that they like. Of course, if they like Picasso, then they're going to be very offended at what I'm saying. But even if they're not big fans of Picasso, they still get offended by like how I analyze
Well, one of the endnotes in the book said that Picasso produced like 50,000 pieces of art. I
it.
saw that after I read the book. I was like, that makes it all make sense. Like
Yeah.
art as industry, right?
Yeah, well, at least for Picasso, because the only thing that mattered for him was his signature. He could put a signature on anything, and it would suddenly be worth a lot of money. And this is sort of like the subtle shift that art has taken as a result of fiat money. It's no longer about the art; it's about the artist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and that's because it's no longer about the end product; it's about the endorsement, which unfortunately is very common in any status or political game, is that you want endorsements from like the people that are high up, and that's sort of like a way of showing off your status. And that's what art has become. It used to be about, you know, beauty and, you know, sort of the art itself and how it impacts the person looking at it or experiencing it in some way. But that's no
Froze for
longer
a
the
second.
case because it's become about the endorsement of this popular famous person. It doesn't really matter how they got popular or
I'm
famous.
not sure if you could.
It's just that they're already at the top of this status hierarchy, and getting their endorsement is really the act of buying the art now. It's not at all about the merits of the piece. It's about the endorsement or your association with that person. It's part of that political game. So um, that is, I think, maybe why it's so offensive to a lot of people, because they don't want to admit that it is a status game, that it is based not on any kind of reality, but on sort of almost a Nietzschean will to power dynamic. And whoever gets to the top, doesn't matter what they got there with or how they got there, they matter because they're at the top, right? Like that's sort of the attitude of most art people. And they want to be at there too if they're an artist, and they're like working hard towards getting up that thing. And as soon as you reject that whole hierarchy, they want to reject you because they don't like that uh, you don't subscribe to the, you know, status game that art has. So yeah, it's a weird dynamic. And you know, I think the way that fiat money sort of like enters into this is, first of all, there's a lot of store of value premium put into art because it's actually scarce, especially after the artist dies, right? So
Mm.
there's a it's nowhere good to store the money, so people need to go find a good store of value, and there are very few good stores of value. So one of the things that's actually scarce is art, that's especially of a dead artist, but there's not nearly enough of those to go around. So you end up having modern art that sort of takes its place, and that becomes its own sort of like status game, or like it's kind of like altcoin trading. You know, what's going to be popular, what's not going to be popular. Something like 80% of all art that's sold at Sotheby's, you know, which is like the
Mm-hmm.
most premier art auction, they don't get sold again, which is crazy. But you know, so it's like this weird risk game where you try to buy the 20% that's going to sell again, and then you know, invest in that, and then that's like many multiples in a few years when it's sold again because it became popular. It's a very weird and strange dynamic. So that's part of it. There's a inherent status game that goes into it because of the presence of fiat money, because of all the store of value premium that's going into it, and people sort of have to compete and do research and waste a lot of time on this stuff because there is no good place to store their money. Instead of creating goods and services, they're playing weird status games with the art that they own to try to make it more popular or whatever. So that's a part of it. But the other one is that it's what fiat money does is it creates all of these experts and authorities, instead of having people that are able to sort of like see it for themselves. And part of it is that we do have communication mediums and educational institutions and experts, more or less, in a lot of this stuff. And the people that are at the top get to decide what's good. And those are obviously great rent-seeking positions if you could get them, because you're going to get invited to every party and be paid a lot of money to endorse this or that, because you have a lot of power. You have the ability to create new artists that are going to be popular and so on. So that that dynamic means that everybody sort of falls in line with the current orthodoxy of art, and you get weird stuff not becoming popular, not through merit, but through politics and status games. And yeah, that's what I write about. I'm like, I criticize modern art for a lot of things, among others, that they're producing a lot of it, within very short time frames, and it's all proof of stake and not proof of work. And I contrast it to something, Michelangelo's La Pietà, right? That took a few years to make, and he only carved his name on it after it was created, because somebody mistook it, and he always regretted it for the rest of his life. Like, art should speak for itself, and it's unfortunate, but now it's all about the artist and not the art itself.
Yeah, he, like, Michelangelo, like, snuck in or broke into the owner's house or something like that to carve his name into it.
Yeah, he I think it was at St. Peter's even then, or actually no, it was at a church, and he just like went in and carved it that night, something like that. But I mean, he's not the only one. Like, you go to a lot of these churches in Rome, none of those statues have any signatures on them. The idea is that the statues themselves are beautiful, and you're supposed to appreciate it, not because some artist made it, but because of what it is, right? Like, what it represents and how it emotionally moves you and so on. And a lot of art now is nothing like that. It is all about branding based on who made it. And if you don't know who made it, oh, you Philistine, you heathen, how dare you, think about art without like the artist or something like that. And, their weird backstory or whatever. And like, the meaning has to be derived from like 50 different, details or something. It's just all a very weird, esoteric game that people at the top play. And, I don't like it. And I think it's been very bad for art in general.
So it's interesting that people really reacted strongly to that chapter when you include elsewhere in the book, fiat debases relationships, fiat debases families, fiat debases marriage, right? Yeah. Fiat undermines work. That people, of all the things that they would pick on art. I found that to be a very revealing chapter, because it helped articulate a bunch of things that I had been feeling but couldn't quite say why. But to make the moral case that fiat currency has debased this entire world of representational art and made it abstract and on the artist as opposed to the merits of the work itself. It's like, oh, that's why I hate it.
Yeah, I think perhaps the reason why people are so offended at that chapter is because they like modern. That might be the thing. Like, most of this other stuff, they recognize the problems around family relationships, work, or education, or science, or whatever. But art, it's like, oh, I like art. Or I have a friend that's an artist, and like you're like dunking on him or whatever. I suspect that's why. But also, artists have this fraternity where they really don't like criticism of themselves or their friends, something like that. I suspect that's a part of it. But I mean, like, if I were to write that chapter again, I think I would end with something like, under a Bitcoin standard, I think it changes not just because you have art that's more representational, more clearly beautiful, more proof of work, but I think you get the patronage system that we've had for a long time, and
Mm.
the requirements for a patronage system are somebody that is very talented, obviously, so somebody like a Michelangelo or a Da Vinci or whatever, somebody that is very rich, that has a lot of resources, but that person also has to be able to recognize what is good art and talent, right? Like the ability to create art. We don't really have that part. We have lots of rich people, we have lots of artists, but what we don't have is any rich people that recognize talent because,
Right.
like it's like it's all subjective, it's all arbitrary. So it's more about figuring out what might become popular later, and that's based on the tastemakers and so on. Instead about like I think Bernini was. There was a patron that paid for everything, like recognized Bernini's talent very early at the age of 21 or something like that, and started saying, okay, just produce statues for me. Here's I'm going to fund everything. And I would say that to artists, like that's the way you want to make your
Mhm.
living, is having patrons and being able to create instead of having everything be so commercial as it is now, where your work has to sell or else you're going to go hungry. And in order for your work to sell, you have to have a gallery showing. And if you're going to have a gallery showing, then you're going to have to get in good with the gallery owner or an art critic or somebody. You have to play all of these political games instead of doing the actual work of creating. And in a sense, you have to do all of this other stuff instead of the thing that you're most passionate about, the thing that makes you an artist. And unfortunately, it's the people that are really good at that political game that end up being popular, right? Like Andy Warhol, people like that. Like they're very good at promoting themselves. I was reading in another book how it's like, yeah, I actually can't really draw anything else. And he hires he hired like 18 art students right out of like one of these art schools, and he conceptualizes something and has them do the actual work.
Oh.
Like like and a lot of famous artists are kind of like that now, where they have a whole stable of people doing the actual work. They do most of the promotion and talking about it and getting in good with the right people. It's become an entire political game, and that's not the right system, I think, to produce good art, to create art that's going to last for generations and so on. If you want that to happen, I think you need patrons, you need people that are able to recognize talent, but no one, very few people actually recognize talent at all right now, because it's all based on status games, and it's not about talent, it's about your political skill. So going to a more uh, uh, sound money standard, I think brings all of that back, because once you have a rich person that says, I want to see more beauty, and this person can produce it, I'm going to fund this person. Yeah, that's how I think a lot of really great art happens.
So I want to talk about the Bitcoin standard and how sound money fixes a lot of these things. But the two more topics I want to cover first are families and marriage. And I did want to say real quick, I think Banksy is a good example of an artist. Like, no one knows who Banksy is, but I always thought Banksy was like one person who was orchestrating a team of
Uh-huh.
people in the way that
Uh-huh.
you kind of articulated.
Yeah, and part of it, like there are certain techniques that he used to catch the attention of the art critics and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And there's actually a cool YouTube video that you can go watch about this guy that learned some of the techniques that Banksy used and managed to get his own show and sold like $1 million worth of stuff after like 3 months. Just
Oh, wow.
it's very systematized and it's very purposeful, and it's a way to climb up that status ladder, because at least in the art world, if they pay attention to you at all, then like the game is over. But like the way that they suppress the things that they don't like is they pay no attention to you, give you no space,
Mhm.
no oxygen at all. So yeah, that's one of the weird things about the art world, and I think it's because you have these Cantillon insiders that are able to print their own money by saying that this is now hot, and they got a donation of like 10 of that artist's paintings right before they said that, right? Like that sort of stuff happens all the time.
Like pre-mining.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk quickly about how fiat debases marriage and family and relationships, because I think art is controversial, but I think this is a much more fundamental topic.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate, but like a lot of people are now very dependent on the state. As we talked about before, one of the things that the government can do when they're able to do this stealth taxation through inflation is promise you a lot of free stuff. So our relationships have been debased because that's what we used to depend on is no longer really what we're depending on anymore. We're depending instead on government. So it used to be that you had an extended family, and if you lost your job or something, the people in your family would help you out. If you got sick or something, and you didn't have money to pay for a doctor, people in your family would help you out. If both of your parents were killed, you would be adopted by your family in some way, shape, or form, and be raised up that way. The safety net was your family, and that was the normal way of being, and that was the normal sort of social group that you identified most with. It's no longer that way. I think most people identify way more with the companies that they work for than their family now. But more than that, you have all of these safety nets. You have stuff like health insurance and unemployment insurance and Medicare and life insurance or whatever. You have all of these financial products that are sort of stand-ins for the relationships that used to be the reason why you didn't have to worry as much about those things. And as a result, people are less dependent on each other, so they're less connected to each other, and you have worse communities as a result. The quality of relationship is not one of dependence. It's just almost purely to have fun or something, right? Like to be social or something like that. And that's debased it, because you need some of that dependence to make it real, to make it cost something, to have some proof of work in there. But more than that, because all of these things exist to sort of like be your safety net, people are less incentivized to have kids, because kids were ultimately the thing that took care of you when you were old. We didn't have Social Security or Medicare or anything like that before, say, the Federal Reserve. Families took care of each other, and you had kids because they were sort of the equivalent of Social Security, right? Like, or Social Security is just sort of like a very debased form of having children, or Medicare is a very debased form of having children. They were supposed to take care of you. That was the idea. But instead of like relationships with your kids, now you have like this relationship with your government, a faceless entity that sort of takes your money and promises to give it back to you, and it's based on sort of a broken, bankrupt system anyway. So of course, like, people are a little less satisfied with that, but because they're less incentivized to have children, they have fewer of them. But even more than that, we've been getting stolen from, and we've been getting poorer. Now, that's kind of a controversial statement, because like the stuff that we have now with like an iPad or something like that, like even Rockefeller, who was like the richest man in the world at one point, like having some significant percentage of the US GDP, like he didn't have an iPad or anything like it, right? Like, and that's in that sense, we have stuff that people of old didn't, but we're also very poor. And the reason I say that is, if you think about, say, like 30 or 40 years ago, at least when I was growing up, my dad worked, my mom stayed at home. Now, that's not something that most people can say now, right?
Yeah.
Both parents work. I mean, there's like women's liberation and stuff like that, but that's not the reason why both parents work. Most of the time, both parents work because they need to. They need to make their ends meet, right? Like they've just gotten poor. Also, look at the housing, right? Like at least my parents were able to buy a house, and it was reasonably priced or whatever. If you're starting out right now, there's no way you could buy a house, right? You've gotten poorer, right? Think about the cars, right? That you're able to drive. I mean, if you are able to drive, buy one, it's nice, but it costs a lot more money than it used to. Uh, we've gotten poorer, and that means that we don't have the resources to put into children. So if you want to have like 4 kids, you're going to um, need a lot of money to raise them,
Yeah.
and we're not getting paid enough for that. You're also going to need a bigger house, and you need to pay for that, and that like people just can't afford it. So in a sense, um, all of that sort of like safety net that you get, it comes at a cost because it has to fund all of those rent seekers in the middle, and that means everyone else that's productive has to work that much more. And so you get lesser birth rates pretty much everywhere, where the fiat system has taken away so much of the wealth or has taxed so much of your productivity that that you don't have anything left over to go and have kids or whatever. I was looking at the statistics that I saw on Twitter today. I think other than like 3 or 4 countries, at least in that list of like 50 or so, and one of them was like Kyrgyzstan and one was like Uzbekistan, all of the birth rates are under 2, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Less than 2 children per woman. Uh, it's getting to the point where we're we're funding the old people at the cost of the young. It's just not going to be able to be paid for. And it's unfortunate because it used to be that children were additive to a family, right? Even now, like if you have a relative or a brother or sister that's a doctor and you have a medical problem, who's the first person you call?
Mhm.
Right? Like it's so obvious that they add value in that way. It was much more so in the past when families were closer. It would be okay. Let's I need to expand my business. Where can I find like a trusted person that can work for me? You would go to your extended family and try to hire somebody from there, right? Like that was the way. It was a value add to your family. And marriage, think about what marriage was. It was bringing 2 families together. Your network got double the size, right? Like that was a boon to everybody on both sides, right? Even if it's like a little bit of a tangential connection where it's like a cousin-in-law or something like that. It was useful because now okay, I can hire that person or I can go to them for goods and services, and there's a relationship there, and there's not as much of a need for trust or something like that because the trust is implicit in the relationships that existed. A lot of that has gone away, and it's been substituted with sort of like very faceless, trusted third parties that are authorities over you, despite whatever, and they tell you what to believe and what to think, and it's taken over instead of family having its rightful role.
I think that's going to be very relevant. I mean, these are things that a lot of the men that I know really struggle with. Is how expensive everything is, children, homes, etc. How am I going to up my income enough to provide for a family? How am I going to save? Men are really feeling, especially in an economy where the bias is also clearly towards women, so economically as well in terms of promotions. I hear that a lot from men in corporate environments, that all things being equal, that a woman's going to get the promotion over a man. And so men are really feeling, and so that they opt into the trades, but in many cases the trades also provide like a lower a lower income ceiling, right? Like how much can a plumber reasonably earn in a day? It's righteous work, it's noble work, but you're not going to earn as much as you can in like a rent seeking position, for example. And so men are really feeling all these things, and it was your book that helped me put all these pieces together.
Yeah, it's interesting though, as the interest rates rise and you get more reality coming into sort of slap these corporations around a little bit. The thing a higher interest rate environment does is that it reduces the money printing, right? Like uh, all money printing happens through debt. So it happens through loans. The lower the interest rate is, the more the monetary expansion is. The higher the rate is, the less monetary expansion is. In fact, we're kind of getting a monetary contraction. The M2 is coming down for the first time in a long time, in part because the interest rates are so high. So another way to sort of look at that is that reality is sort of reasserting itself. Fiat money lets you suspend reality by printing lots of it, by stealing from everybody else. And it lets you sort of have lots of rent seekers and stuff like that and pay them very well. But that can only go on so long. At a certain point, as rates go up, reality is reasserting itself. And what we're seeing is that a lot of these trades, a lot of these manual work, the noble work, the actual productive work, the things that are adding value to the economy and so on, those are the jobs that are getting the raises, which is very interesting. So I'm sure you saw with the UPS settlement, the UPS driver, the average UPS driver, I think with all the benefits included, make $170,000 a year, right? And I think they deserve. I think they deserve every penny, because if you think about it, what happened was with a company like Twitter, you had a bunch of staff that was doing political stuff, right? Like stuff that wasn't adding any value to the company. Elon got rid of like 90% of them. How much money were they making? Probably like, because it's San Francisco, 250, 300, 450, whatever.
Yeah.
Like that money is being redirected to ultimately to the UPS driver. And I think that's more just, because a UPS driver is actually providing value. A plumber is actually providing value. A welder is actually providing value. Truck drivers are actually providing value. And in a sense, I think that's where this all is leading. And I said before that rent-seeking positions tend to have a higher status in a fiat economy, because it looks really prestigious, because a lot of people want it. And to get selected to do it, you either have to be like extraordinarily well qualified, or you're a crony or something like that. So people desire it, and they tend to have a lot of status. But as you go away from a fiat system to a more sound money system, I think a lot of these other things that actually provide value go up in status, because the rent-seeking jobs kind of disappear, and they become kind of known as jobs that like don't provide any value. We get reality reasserting itself. So in a sense, like I want the men that are listening to your podcast to understand that really providing value, adding value, if you focus on that, you should be okay. Because the fiat system, the rent-seeking system, the Cantillon winning system is destined to end at some point. Now, I don't know when that's going to happen, but as that ends, you're going to be best positioned if you are not one of those rent seekers. So, if you're, for example, a bank vice president or something like that, like, I don't know, they have like 200 vice presidents for every branch or something, right? I don't even know. And you try to get a job after that, you're not going to get hired by anybody but a big bank, right? And there's only so many of those jobs, and there's a very small number of people that can get those jobs. So yeah, it is kind of like a zero-sum game. If a woman makes it ahead of you, then you're not going to get that job, and so on. Instead of relying on that, on your political skill, rely on the value that you can add. So if you are working in a trade or something like that, and you're a better plumber, you're going to win, because there's an objective standard and not a political one. And that's where we lead as you go away from a fiat standard to a sound money standard like Bitcoin. Is you get reality reasserting itself, and merit is rewarded. So I would encourage the people that are listening to this show to really find something that you're good at and get really good at it and provide value that way, right? Like in whatever it is that you're good at. Maybe you are a good plumber, and if you're an extraordinary plumber, you're going to get paid. It's just a matter of time. But if you're a really good political player, well, good luck with that. Like those only work in giant corporations, and like a lot of those don't make any money. They're all zombie companies anyway. So when they collapse, where are you going to go? You're going to have to go learn something that provides value to the economy anyway, and it'll be better for your soul because ultimately you're providing value to people. You're making them things better for them, and they're happy to hand you some money to solve a problem that they have, and that's the trade that we want is value providing stuff. And honestly, the trades seem like very undervalued right now because part of it is because of the dollar hegemony and so on, where a large part of the United States work in some sort of rent-seeking position, but the few people that are actually producing, like they're very hard to find. Have you tried to hire a contractor to do something for your house or whatever? It's actually very difficult. Because and they have like lots and lots of work. They could charge lots and lots of money because of the inflation that's happening and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that noble work is going to also pay in the future. So, skate to where the puck is going, not where the puck is.
Yes. And if you have just another minute or two, just plug the last piece of Bitcoin into this, men providing value, exiting the fiat system. What does Bitcoin have to do with all of this?
Yeah, so Bitcoin is sound money, and it is money that cannot get debased. And if you have Bitcoin, if you have one Bitcoin right now, you have 1/21 millionth of all the Bitcoin that will ever exist, always and forever. And it's not controlled by anybody. It's decentralized, and it's what we call sound money. And it is the very opposite of fiat money, which has a central controller that can print money whenever they want, and change the monetary policy or whatever. And that's what essentially controls the economy today. With Bitcoin, you have sound money. It's based on it's a decentralized system, so no one controls it. And that a system based on Bitcoin cures a lot of the ills of the fiat monetary system because there's no money printer. And that's what I point out in the book is that, in a sense, we're beset by all of the fiat shenanigans in our lives, but you get rid of fiat money by having sound money, and Bitcoin is that sound money. And gold was sound money for a while, but we now have paper gold, and there's lots of problems with gold. But with Bitcoin, we have something better, and it's digital and it's verifiable and so on, which makes it a lot easier to store your value, to work in a real economy instead of like a sort of like a reality suspended one, which is essentially the fiat economy.
Well, thank you so much for all that. I've had a number of Bitcoin thinkers on, Laser Hodl, Svetsky, Tomer Strolight, and I really appreciated how your book and your perspective made the moral case for Bitcoin. I guess you might say societally, like the rot that we're seeing, the struggle that we're all experiencing is due to this money printer, and Bitcoin fixes this, pun intended. So I really, but you didn't make that case throughout the entire book. You was like, here, let me just paint the picture for you of why things are the way they are. And there is actually a solution to all of these problems that all point back to the same root.
Yeah. I mean, it's like I said at the beginning, you're by moving to Bitcoin, it's more removing the rot of fiat, right? Like it's like you're removing sugar from your diet or something like that. It's that's going to be way more beneficial than the additional meat that you're eating or vitamins you're taking or whatever. It's getting rid of the poison is more important than adding anything new. if you're a Christian, it's removing of sin is more important than the adding of discipline. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Well, can you speak about your faith and how this plays into it as well? Because I really appreciated that. I really appreciate your discussion to that at the end, the very brief discussion.
Yeah, well, I wrote a whole other book on this. Thank God for Bitcoin, which you can go take a look at.
I've read that too.
Yeah. So I make the case in that book about how Bitcoin is a much more biblically sound money, or a biblical money. And I argue that fiat money is a corrupt money, and it is everything that is the opposite of what God teaches about sowing and reaping. The entire fiat system is based on debt. So it's bringing consumption forward through debt and being enslaved. The biblical model is sowing and then reaping, right? Like saving up and then getting what you want at the end, instead of getting what you want and then being enslaved for however long, which is the current fiat model. I go through the history of money and how it corrupts politics and churches and individual morals and so on. And I present Bitcoin towards the end there. I don't think the word Bitcoin is mentioned until chapter 8. And it's only to show that it's an alternative to fiat money. And yeah, we wrote that, I think 2.5 years ago. And it's done really well. Had a really good reception by a lot of Christians, many of whom have told me, like, I never thought about money in this way, but it makes a lot of sense. And even a lot of Bitcoiners that have read that and said, I need to go back to church. These people are aligned with what I believe. So, so it's Christianity. Christ has been a big part of my life, and I've been a Christian since I was 9 or 10. So it's something that's more important to me than Bitcoin, which,
right?
How much I like Bitcoin. That's saying something. So. It's something that I hope more Christians understand. And just to give a quick plug, there's a Thank God for Bitcoin Telegram group and a Thank God for Bitcoin organization that's run by one of my co-authors, Jordan Bush, and he puts on conferences to talk about this stuff. There's a lot of missions work that he's working on to enable a lot of the transfer of funds and stuff like that to missionaries all over the world, and to fund some of these communities that are trying to get out from underneath the tyranny of whatever government that they're under. So there's a lot of good stuff going on in there, and there's a fairly significant community. There's even a conference. So if you're interested, please check out tgfb.com.
Great. Yeah, I was at Thank God for Bitcoin and met Jared there back in, I think it was April in Florida. So you've set his interview up perfectly, sir. Thank you.
There you go.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your generosity of your time. Where would you like to send people to find out more about you and what you do and your book as well?
Yeah, so you can go to Twitter or X now. My username is Jimmy Song. I have a newsletter, jimmysong.substack.com, that is mostly talking about technical stuff, but I also post some things I find interesting. And, a lot of that is, you'll get a flavor of what I pay attention to in the world. And I promise you, it's not like any fluff piece about Biden or something like that. I also, if you're interested in the book, go to fiatruinseverything.com. You can buy a signed copy there. You can also go to Amazon and buy it directly there, or buy it with Bitcoin on bitcoinmagazine.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that. I'll be sending everyone your way to learn about how fiat ruins everything. Fiat delenda est.
Indeed.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.